So we'll be starting spring quarter on Sunday. And don't forget, next Wednesday night, we're going to do a trial in the month of March of having Wednesday evening Bible study begin at 7 o'clock. So next Wednesday night, we'll be doing this at 7 o'clock. So just don't forget that. We want to mention some folks who are in need of prayer. Sandy Colwell Hodgson, she's going to be having knee replacement surgery next Monday, March the 6th. Let's not forget Yasmin Barnes is recovering from an automobile accident. She went back to work already, but she was pretty banged up. So let's keep her in our prayers. Everyone recovering from surgery. Want to continue to remember Amy Hill. She's still home recovering. Everyone fighting cancer, our expectant mothers. We have a listing in your bulletin that you should have received today. Also, just some announcements that we need to make. On March the 5th, that's this coming Sunday, immediately following morning services, please join us in the fellowship hall for a brief informational meeting about Relay for Life. It's a community service project that helps fund cancer research, and we've had a team for how many years now? A long time. Yeah, more than 10. Yeah. So, if you'd like to know more about that, please join us this coming Sunday, March the 5th, in the fellowship room immediately following morning services. And then the young adults have their first Sunday games after AM service. This is coming Sunday. We want to remind you of that. We have this announcement. Starting Wednesday, March 8th, the weekly young adults meeting at Panera on Wednesday night will be temporarily suspended with service time being moved up. So if you're in that group, that weekly meet and meet and eat will be temporarily suspended for the month of March. So we don't want to mention that to you as well. There's a serving by sewing event on the 11th. The LTL, our guys and girls are going to be having a live rehearsal on Sunday, March the 12th at 5 p.m. We're all invited to be here to support our ladies, our young ladies in the fellowship room, our young men right here in the auditorium. And there are other events, March events, listed in your bulletin from today. Also, there's an update on the items we need for Nourishing Ninjas. We're going to be collecting through Sunday, March the 12th. So we have the rest of this week and next week, and then Sunday, March the 12th, to be supporting Nourishing Ninjas and at-risk children right here in our own community. Okay, we also have this note. The Woodbridge Church of Christ ladies are hosting a brunch and devotional on March the 18th at 10:30 a.m. at the Woodbridge Church of Christ Church building. All ladies are welcome to come and enjoy fellowship with one another. Several of the ladies from Woodbridge have been worshiping with us on Wednesday night and have done for about a year now. And we've gotten, and some come to our ladies' Bible class. So really do appreciate them having an event and inviting our ladies to it as well. We'll get that published for you. But right now, let's lift our voices together and sing praise to God.
Our first song tonight will be 961, On Bended Knee. Before we sing, just want to clarify something in the bulletin. The Devo on the 17th, that is being hosted by the young adult group. So that's Friday, March 17th. That will be the young adult group doing the Devo. Okay, 961. On bended knee I come, with a humble heart I come, bowing down before your holy throne, lifting holy hands to you, as I pledge my love anew. I worship you in spirit, I worship you in truth. Make my life a holy praise unto you. We're going to sing one more song, number 500 in the book. Number 500 in the book, O Thou Fount of Every Blessing. O Thou fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me ever to adore thee, may I still thy goodness prove, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus saw me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Never let me wander from thee. Never leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. Prayer.
Please bow with me. Kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We're thankful for this time midweek where we can come together, open your word, spend time in it as a family. I pray that you please be with the teachers and help them to have thoroughly prepared, help them to impart your wisdom. I pray that you please be with everyone who's in class and help them to be open and receptive to your word, and that word would grow in their hearts. Guide us, dear Lord, and use us. Help us to shine your light in the world around us, and help us one day to come home to you. I pray this through Christ. Amen.
All right, good evening. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone that has endured through the last 12 weeks. You would be happy to know that tonight is the last week. Usually, when I teach a class, the last couple of weeks, there's more people there. I won't take it personally. So we are going to finish up with Nehemiah today, or at least that's my hope, that we can get through the last 3 chapters. So I will find myself, and if you guys would bear with me here as we kind of summarize, hit a couple of highlights as we go through chapters 11, 12, and hopefully 13. And so, get your track shoes on, because here we go. So Nehemiah 11 and 12, because last week I asked you guys to read Nehemiah 10 on your own, which was just a telling or a writing down of all the things that they committed to do. Okay? So Nehemiah 11 and 12, well, really, these 2 books are another portion of Scripture where you think, okay, so why exactly did God include all of these names? And there is indeed a reason for it, as there is with everything that God does. So these 2 chapters include the families who repopulated Jerusalem, chapter 11, verses 3 to 24. The regular families are described in 3 through 9, and then the priests in Jerusalem are described in 10 through 14, and then the Levites, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants are between 11:15 and 11:24. The families who lived in the cities of Judah and Benjamin, this goes on to list those, and they are from 11:25 through 36. And that division, and so that goes there. So then when you get into chapter 12, you have the priests and the Levites of Zerubbabel's return, and they're listed between chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, the high priest, 10 and 11, and the priests and the Levites after Zerubbabel and Jeshua, 12 through 26. And then they get to the dedication of the wall, which is described in chapter 12, verses 26 through 43. Now, here are some things about the dedication of the wall and the organization of the temple support. We have to come to realize that this is not just some rabble of refugees that are settling down just anywhere that they can find a place to settle down. Okay? These people have, there's a dignity to the order and the known relationships that they have. We have to remember that their calling is to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, according to Exodus 19:6, which is one of the main reasons that they were brought out of Egypt in the first place. So these people had to have willing hearts to do whatever God wanted them to do, and each functioned in their own unique capacity. So everyone had to be involved in order to properly honor God and keep his commandments. Everyone. So they were willing to live where God wanted them to live. Now, this is an important thing because these people had kind of settled in the area surrounding Jerusalem, but not in Jerusalem. So they had acreage that they were farming. Some of them tended cattle, others tended sheep. They had carved out a life for themselves, built homes, and all of these things outside of the city. Because with no walls, it was just a heap of rubble, and there was no sense in trying to live there. Well, now they're being asked to come back. And so they had to pull up their roots and come back. So there were about 3,044 men that are listed as those who wanted to live in the city. If you estimate about 10,000 conservatively, who moved into the city within the total population of about 100,000 Jews in the land. So it was still not a whole lot of people, okay? It's important to note that you had the people who were the heads of the families. They were kind of obligated to move in, okay? Then you had the people that moved in because they lost out on the lottery, right? It was, they cast lots, and so it was 1 out of 10. So if you hit that 1, you had to move. But the real heroes here are the people that volunteered to go back and to reestablish their roots in the city of Jerusalem. So we get on to some other important aspects here, because these folks served in the roles in which God called them to serve. Now, this is an important thing for us today. And after I kind of look at what it says in the text here, in chapter 11 lists the heads of the families in Jerusalem, 3 through 9, the priest, 10 through 14, the Levites, 15 through 18, the gatekeepers and the temple servants, 19 through 21, various officials appointed by the king of Persia, 22 through 24, and the people who lived outside of the city, 25 through 36. So this is all in chapter 11. Each of these people served in his or her respective role for the effective operation of the city and the nation. So what did those in the city not have the ability to do? They couldn't farm, right? And some of us have really made a valiant effort and a good attempt to grow 1 or 2 tomato plants on our deck, right? Yeah, we understand how difficult that could be, let alone try to feed your entire family with that, okay? So they lost the ability to farm, okay? And your neighbors wouldn't like it very much if you had a herd of sheep in your house with you as well, okay? So there are things that could not be done. So those that lived outside of the city had to farm the lands provided to provide food for those in the city. And so each one had a different role, but each role was vital to the entire operation. So now it's time for a little introspection, right? In the body of Christ, God has gifted each of us in different ways, and every part is vital to the overall functioning and health of the body. 1 Corinthians 12, 12 through 30. So what does that mean for us here in Manassas? That means that James has certain skills and talents, and James should use those skills and talents in order to edify the body. But so does every other member of this congregation. They're not all the same skills. Okay, trust me. You don't want me doing what Mike Cooch was up here just doing a few minutes ago. Okay? You just don't want that. However, I use what I have in order to support the body. And I would ask each and every one of you to do the same. Find a way to connect, find a way to utilize the skills and talents that God has given to you in order to support the entire body. That is the role and duty of every single Christian, period. Okay? We must all use those skills because he didn't give them to you for you to keep to yourself. He didn't give them to you for you to use in a secular job and make money with. He gave them to you so that you could use them for his praise and his glory. So there is a way, there is something that can be done. We just have to find it. Now, many of these people served without any real levels of acclaim. No type of acknowledgement. They just went in and they routinely did what they had to do. So if you think about some of these names, right? Some of these names that are listed or that are lumped together really don't mean a whole lot to us, okay? Zebdiel in chapter 11, verse 14. Who is he? What's his background? What's his history? Who knows? It's not covered. We get no other information other than his name being on this list. Now, he is a part of the 128 kinsmen who were warriors. So these 128 valiant warriors Well, while they are nameless people to us or unrecognizable names to us, they played a very important role in securing and the safety of the city. So every member is important and vital to the congregation. Now, the church needs people like that function behind the scenes. There's another way that those talents and skills can be used. Okay, there are members of this congregation that come here on a Thursday afternoon or Thursday morning, Tuesday morning, when nobody else is here, and they tend the garden. Or they help to set something up, or they do other things. These people, if they wanted attention, they'd call it to themselves. I'm not calling their names because clearly they don't want the attention. But God sees and knows exactly who they are and what they're doing. And it is recognized and appreciated by all of us, whether we realize that someone is doing it or not, because someone is doing it. Faithfulness without fame. Okay? Faithfulness without fame. This was a huge practice during this time that was being called out. And, Jesus, Matthew 6:1 says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. And then Hebrews 6:10 says, for God is not so unjust as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints. So the things that we do don't go unnoticed by the one that's most important, and that's God. He sees these things. We recognize that God puts people first and not programs. This is also incredibly important because we serve a God that's all about relationships. Okay, first with him, then with everyone else around us. Relationships matter. People matter. Souls are important. So it is indeed about relationships and not about programs. So to serve, one of the lessons that we learn here from chapter 12 is that a servant needs a pure heart. Because when they went through the process of preparing for the celebration to dedicate the wall, okay, the big part of that was purity. They cleansed themselves. They ceremonially cleansed themselves. Then they cleansed the wall. Then they cleansed themselves, the temple, and then the wall. Okay? They had to be pure. So a good servant needs a pure heart. A servant needs a worshipful heart. 12:27 and then 31 through 43. The whole reason that this was being done was not to give Nehemiah any levels of praise. This was not about celebrating his accomplishments. This was all about, the whole purpose was praising God. And so Nehemiah organized two choirs to walk down opposite directions on the top of the wall until they converged at the temple. They sang praises to the accompaniment of cymbals and harps and lyres. The chapter refers 6 times to David, who is twice called the man of God. David was a man after God's own heart because he was a worshiper of God. He had set up the whole system of worship that these people were seeking to follow, chapter 12 and verse 46. So, the truth of the matter is that God doesn't want our work. He doesn't need our skills or our talents. What God wants is our worship. And we should do that all the time. Okay? Now, whether that's worship in a corporate setting, or worship in your prayers in your home alone, or as you're driving down the street, we always need to be aware of and giving thankfulness and praise to God above, because without him, it would just be a big black space of nothing. So, the other thing that a servant needs is a joyful heart. 12:43, as you read the account of this dedication service, you get the distinct impression that these people were enjoying themselves. Okay, you absolutely, as you read through this, and I encourage you to do so, you get the feeling that these people were really, really enjoying themselves. Okay, in fact, verse 44, it says, the joy of Jerusalem was heard from afar. That means all of those people who stood in opposition to the building of the wall heard the joy of their celebration. They heard the joy of their praise. So a servant needs a pure heart, a worshipful heart, and a joyful heart. And lastly, on this note, a servant needs a giving heart. This was very important in chapter 12, verses 44 through 47, because what we come to realize there is that things had changed, and they're no longer giving to support the singers and the Levites and those that were who had been dedicated for temple service. So what had happened was these people had to leave and stop doing what the things that God had commanded them to do, and because they now had to go out and farm their land and make a living so they could put food on their tables. And so one of the things that Nehemiah made sure was taking place at this point was giving. And so, it was described as a joyful giving because they saw the importance of worship at the temple. And so they were willing to give the necessary offerings to support the many priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, and so on who served there. Because if you recall, the tribe of Levi, they weren't allowed to do anything other than be priests and work in the temples. That was their role. And the other 11 tribes were responsible for providing for their needs. That's the way God set it up. Yes, sir.
Levites also had herds of animals that they kept for themselves.
Yes, but most of those, I had one commentator indicate that those are largely due for the sacrifices that they had to do in order to be cleansed to go into the temple, to do the sacrifices for everyone else. So, yes, you are correct there. But they weren't growing crops. They couldn't go to war. They didn't have a lot of the other responsibilities that would take place in the nation, other than being priests. Then we get to Nehemiah chapter 13. And in Nehemiah chapter 13, what we find is that Nehemiah has left and he's come back. Okay? So it's indicated, well, most commentators think that he went back and he was probably gone 10 to 12 years. Okay? So it's about 10 to 12 years between chapter 12 and chapter 13. So he went back to his kingly duties or to the king for his duties as a cupbearer, most likely. And then later he asked if he could come back, and he came back. And then chapter 13 is sort of what happens when he gets back and what he found. So 13 verses 1 and 2, on that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, God turned the cursing into a blessing. Who remembers that story? So they hired Balaam to go and pronounce a false prophecy, and Balaam was all for it. He was on his way. And he had to go on a mountain where there was a narrow pass, where there was really only, it's like a one-lane road, okay, with a mountain on one side and a deep cliff on the other side. And his donkey stopped. And he's angry with the donkey. He's beating on the donkey. The donkey's not going anywhere because the donkey can see something that he can't. And finally, God gives the donkey the power to speak and says, "Why are you hitting me? Don't you see this angel with a flaming sword standing in front of us?" Yes, God will get your attention in some odd ways that are not normal. if you are stubborn enough, okay? So that's another great story. That can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 23, another great place to go back and read what God has done for his people. So long before that, though, the Ammonites and the Moabites had schemed against Israel. So God had made a promise to the father of the Jewish people, Abraham. He made a promise to Abraham that I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3. So this command of the Ammonites and the Moabites not being able to enter into the assembly is another fulfillment of that promise, another proof that God does not forget his promises. So we know that God turned the curse into a blessing. This refers to events that are also found in Numbers chapters 22 through 24, where God blessed Israel, even though the prophet Balaam wanted to curse them. It also reminds us that God is able, more than able. He can turn any curse into a blessing. Then Nehemiah 13:3, after hearing God's command, Israel obeys and separates from the mixed multitude. Now, this gets really interesting here in the next few verses. So it was, and it says, so it was then, that when they heard the law, that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. So what are they talking about when they talk about the mixed multitude? What are they saying here? Who would be the mixed multitude? Margaret?
The answer to that, I think I have the answer. They were not to intermarry with any other peoples, and they had intermarried, so they sent them home. When you were speaking of the curse just now, in chapters 10 and 11, when they were redoing everything, and that's before he went back to, that's the 10 and 13 years he was gone. And then you spoke just now of the one, when they signed that paper, they were going to do it right. They put their seals on, they signed their name, and they said if they didn't honor it, curse. How does that tie into what you're saying?
Hold that thought, because we're going to get there. Yep, we're going to get there. So it was the fact that they had intermarried with Ammonites and Moabites. And so they had to put them out. They had to put them away because they weren't supposed to be a part of the congregation in the first place. So when they separated all the mixed multitudes from Israel, they could have thought of 20 different reasons why they didn't want to do that, right? But they simply obeyed. They just did what God said to do because it was very clear. Now, this is indeed referring to those who associated with people of Israel but did not make a full commitment to or embrace the covenant. So in other words, these people not only intermarried, but they brought their idols and their idol worship and their pagan practices with them into Israel's midst. And that would not go. In 13 chapters 4 through 9, we have the temple reforms. Now before this, Eliashib the priest, having authority over the storerooms of the house of God, was allied with Tobiah. Who is Tobiah? Do we remember him from the beginning of the book? He was right there trying to cause havoc and stop the work, and had prepared for him a large room where previously they had stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, the tithes of grain, and the new wine, which were all commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers, and the offerings for the priests. But during all this, I was not in Jerusalem. For the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then, after certain days, I obtained leave from the king and came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It grieved me bitterly. Therefore, I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. Then I commanded them to cleanse the rooms. I brought back into them the articles of the house of God with grain offerings and frankincense. So here, Nehemiah's been gone for 10 or 12 years. Margaret brought up the contract that they wrote out and signed, saying that they would obey God. They would do everything that was commanded of them to do. A decade or so later, yeah, here they were again. And the big problem here is that Eliashib, he's like the high priest. He's like one of the main people. In other words, there's no one around who has the authority to challenge him. So he thinks. So everybody just kind of says, okay, well, that's what he's doing. You know, we're going to let that be. But then Nehemiah comes back and says, yeah, no, you're a powerful man, but you're not that powerful. This has to stop. So he puts a stop to it. Now, we know that Tobiah is an Ammonite. Says so in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10. And so he was the very problem. He was the very thing that they were talking about when they had just read it in the previous verses. And they immediately agreed and immediately obeyed. But for some reason, this guy was able to escape that because he felt like it didn't apply to him. So this was very distressing. I mean, they were using the rooms in the temple of God, to house an Ammonite. And they were not collecting the tithes and things that they needed to support the temple service because this guy was in the room. That's bad. Yes, Mark.
This is a rabbit hole, and it's not in the scriptures. And I ask the Lord to forgive me because it's going to sound like I'm judging, and we're not supposed to judge them. But I find more distressing even than that, the broken marriages. We wonder why the people of those times, their generations now hated all of it. If the men had done what they were supposed to do in the first place, not just Tobias, but everybody else, all of these things, there were children from those marriages. All these little children, all these wives, all these men, if the men and women had done what they were supposed to do in the first place, they might have brought them to the Lord. But instead, everybody's so, and I apologize for this sounds like I'm judging, but I'm just thinking about all those little children that are left without fathers. They're sent, they and their wives and everybody, and I find that distressing.
Yeah, I can understand that. That's an understandable feeling, to be distressed by that, especially in our day and age, okay? These people had violated a command that came direct from God, okay? And that command was not to marry outside of the nation because they were pagans and they were idol worshipers and they would bring evil into the nation. They were told, do not do that, okay? Now, what we'll find as we go on is that at one point Nehemiah comes to talk to some of these kids and realizes that they don't even speak the language. So the issue there is that the Israelite parent has done nothing to try to influence that child so that they can understand the ways of God. Instead, they've allowed the foreign parent to control the child's basic language, which means that's what they're speaking at home, which means that's the predominant language that's going on whenever they're together as a family. That's bad. And it's a direct command from God not to do that. And he even calls out these two particular peoples in particular and says, don't do that. So, yes, it is hard, but it is their fault because they violated something that they had just a few years ago promised and signed their names to, saying that they were going to commit to and fully obey the Word of God. They had just done that.
sign, cursed be they if they didn't do it? How did they work that out?
You know, it doesn't really go into a lot of detail about that, other than this may have been a part of it. Because we know that God keeps his promises, and we know that God keeps his word. So having to give up your wife and children, that's also hard. You know? Now, purely speculative on my part, okay? I find no direct passage in Scripture to indicate that that's what God considered to be the curse. I don't know. And maybe it was because man that said that we should be cursed and not God that said it directly. It worked out differently. I don't know. So there's no ink put to that in the Scriptures. Barry, unless I'm wrong.
Ruth was a Moabite woman. She's in the lineage of Jesus. She was clearly a worshiper of Yahweh. She said to her mother-in-law, "Your God is my God. Your people are my people. Your God is my God." And she refers to Yahweh by name. In the book of Ezra, when he deals with the same issue, it's clear that the foreign women are still practicing their religion, which at the end of chapter 13, Solomon is going to be invoked as an example.
Right.
And so we've got to think about that too. That would have been an issue. I think, these people aren't meeting their wives on websites. I mean, marriage is transactional. They've been arranged. And these men who are putting their wives out of their households or sending them back to their father's households, I would think. I mean, they're not putting them out on the street. Not that makes anything any easier, especially where children are involved. But there are so many other variables. I don't think we have to think in our heads that, there are multiple wives and children, shivering somewhere in the cold light of the desert, not being cared for. I don't think that's what we're looking at here. So I don't know. That's what I have to add to that conversation.
I think it's a great point. A lot of times we find ourselves reading 2,000+ passages and trying to apply the thinking of us here in 2023. And it's just not that way. So like Barry said, these all would have been arranged marriages, and in all likelihood, they would have been sent back to their father's houses or a relative's house to go and live. And so it's still, the separation of the breaking up of the relationship is still hard because that's a relationship. You know what I'm saying? But I doubt that they were destitute and out there, as Barry said, freezing in the nighttime desert air.
And a woman like Ruth, who's not practicing pagan religion, was accepted.
Was accepted.
Into the fellowship of the people of God. She's in Jesus' lineage. You mentioned,
Yes.
specifically in Matthew chapter 1, in case we were ever to forget that she's there. It's not, there are variables that factor in, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
And in Ezra, it's clear the women that he's describing are women who are still practicing their pagan religion. They've not accepted the true religion of Israel, the religion of their husband that they married, the family they married.
Right. And that's the rub.
Yeah.
They're still practicing their pagan religions. They haven't accepted the religion of the husband. And furthermore, the husband is weak because he has failed to do his duty in accordance with the Scriptures as well. He's supposed to lead his household, okay? And he's clearly not doing that if he's allowing his wife to practice idol worship and paganism in their home and teach their children that language as opposed to the language of his fathers.
The Moabites, at least during the days of Ruth, in their worship of Chemosh, were performing human sacrifice. I mean, these are not, it's not like they belong to a denomination or something. I mean, these idolatrous religions often involve human sacrifice, temple prostitution, all kinds of awful things.
Yes.
And so it's not just so simple as,
Yeah, it's not the same as she squeezes the toothpaste tube from the top versus the bottom,
you're a Christian.
right?
Yeah, it's not the same.
It's not the same kind of thing. It clearly should be done from the bottom and not the top, but we won't go there, okay? Don't want to break up any marriages. But this was a serious thing, though. This was very, very serious, okay? Because it was a direct violation of what God had told them not to do. Then when we get to verses 10 through 14, Nehemiah goes into more detail about the financial reforms, reestablishing the practices of giving, puts people in charge of it, puts people in place to make sure that things are happening, but not only to make sure that things are coming in appropriately, but also to make sure that things are being distributed appropriately as well. So he puts in a lot of effort to kind of bring that back to the place of where it should be. In verses 15 through 22, he gets the priorities straight, okay? So in verses 15 through 22, what is happening is this. The Sabbath day is still to be holy. They're supposed to rest and worship on the Sabbath day. Instead, what they're doing is they are allowing foreign merchants to come into the city, and they are buying and selling from these foreign merchants. And then they're going back, and they're doing this like it's a Tuesday, but it's not a Tuesday. It's the Sabbath day. So one of the things that Nehemiah does here, because the Sabbath day is being ignored, is the first thing he does, he says, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. Shut the gates. So we're going to shut the gates, and we're not going to let anybody in on the Sabbath. Okay? Nobody. There will be no buying and no selling, no trading, no nothing on the Sabbath, because we're going to keep them all out. When they leave on Friday, they're not able to come back until Sunday. Okay? Now, he takes this very, very seriously because God takes it seriously. And one of the last things when you get down towards verse 22 that he does is he says, because they were coming and the foreign merchants were coming, they would spend the night outside the gate so that they would be available as soon as the gates were open. That's what their tactic was. Or maybe some people would try to sneak out of the city in order to buy some things. Who knows what they were trying to do. But Nehemiah says to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. And then he says, remember me, O God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. You cannot ignore the Sabbath day because God said to keep it holy. And for Nehemiah to wink at that and to stand by and not do something about that made him complicit in the ignoring of the Sabbath. And he was saying, oh no, not having that. I'm not doing that, okay? At the root, this problem was a problem of priorities. There's nothing wrong with buying and selling. Just the desire to buy and sell or to make money or spend money cannot become more important than honoring God. Buying and selling, making money cannot become more important than honoring God. That's still a problem today for a lot of folks. Okay? It just is. The New Testament makes it clear that we're not under the law of the Sabbath in the same sense that Israel was under the Old Covenant. Colossians 2:16 and 17. But we are certainly under the same obligation to make honoring God more important than making or spending money. Just a thought, throw that out there. That's an important thing for us all to spend a little time in prayerful consideration of. The other thing is that Nehemiah clearly understood that sin was not only a personal thing. When such open sin is winked at or just ignored, like I said earlier, it's corrected by God in his hand, and it corrects everybody. So what am I saying there? Just like, remember Achan, when he was told to leave all of the spoils, don't bring anything back, and he did. He brought stuff back with him and hid it in his tent, in a hole, under a blanket, and Israel got beaten by a little tiny nation that they should have just mopped the floor with. Well, his sin caused that loss. His sin caused that loss of life. Terrible thing. And God enacted that punishment on the entire nation because of one person's sin. This is what Nehemiah is trying to avoid. So he just wasn't going to sit still for this and just let it happen. Relationship reform, Nehemiah 13:23 through 31. Well, let me read through this one. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them, pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all of this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women?" And one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I drove him from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I cleansed them from everything pagan. I also assigned duties to the priests and the Levites, each to his service, and to bringing the wood offering and the first fruits at appointed times. In the years that Nehemiah was away, the Israelites had resumed their practice of intermarrying with pagan nations that surrounded them. Now, this was dramatic and drastic in their disobedience. This was huge. Remember, it was just a few years ago that they all promised to follow and obey God. And here they are, right back, doing the same thing again. And Sanballat, you have the high priest's son is the son-in-law of Sanballat. Now, here's what we need to understand there too, because Barry mentioned earlier that these were all arranged marriages. Okay? And it's the heads of the households that come together to arrange a marriage. So Sanballat and Eliashib had to come together to discuss that and work out the arrangements. Okay, she's worth how many sheep or how many heads of cattle or how many goats or how many whatever. Yes, all of that had to be done by the heads of the families, not by the two people getting married. So this didn't just happen. They didn't walk past each other and fall in love at first sight. It didn't work that way then. And so that's an important detail for us to make sure that we keep in mind. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair and made them swear. From this strong reaction of Nehemiah, we gather he considered this to be one of the most dangerous of their sins, pursuing ungodly romance and getting involved in romantic relationships that God has said no to. I won't expound on that, but I will say this. Whenever we pursue an ungodly romance or get involved in romantic relationships that God has said no to, we will find ourselves in lieu of judgment, and judgment quickly. Yes?
So we always bring sense and quiet to something that's good. But when we speak of them not going out into the desert, and also at that time, somebody had been in a marriage and they got sent back to their father's house. I don't know quite how to say it. I know you and Mary know. They did not have the same respect that they had before. And in many ways, they were like outcasts because they had already been with someone in marriage, and it changed everything. So I don't want to belabor that because that's
Well,
it's not.
those would have been the laws in Israel.
Right.
We don't, based on what we understand about pagan religions, we don't have any indication that they cared about such things. If they're willing to kill their children to sacrifice them to Moloch, then who cares if she's been with somebody else?
Okay.
Naomi assumes that both Orpah and Ruth will find husbands if they go back to their father's homes.
Yes.
Then their father, the head of the household, the male relative, will be able to arrange other marriages. Probably the person that was out was the husband who paid the bride price.
Yes.
It's not going to be returned. That's why you paid the bride price.
Exactly.
Because if something didn't work out, you didn't get it back.
And the more expensive the bride price, the more harder you work to make sure it worked out.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? But yeah, so it was a completely different time and different environment, different sets of rules, different things applied back then that it's difficult for us to kind of wrap our minds around now because they seem kind of barbaric to us. But this is the way it was at the time. Now, the principle that we get from that is what I just said: pursuing ungodly romance or getting involved in romantic relationships that God has said no to bears with it consequences that are not pleasant. It always has, and it always will. No matter what the law of the land says, that is the truth of God, and it will always be the case. So, remember that and do what God has commanded us to do. Pure and simple. And when we find ourselves in error, not only of that, but of anything, then we should stop, humble ourselves, repent, and turn and walk in the way of the Lord. One of the last things that Nehemiah says is, remember me, O Lord, for good. You get the feeling that Nehemiah feels like he has failed. Because when you consider verse 10, or chapter 10, when the people were all excited and they made all these promises, he walked away from Jerusalem feeling that he had accomplished his mission and that God had seen him through some difficult times, but we got it done. Then he comes back 10 years later and he finds that, yeah, they forgot it the minute I got on my donkey and rode away. You know? Because if these children were old enough to speak, they weren't newborns. Okay? They were not newborns. And if he could have a conversation with them, they weren't toddlers. So these children were old enough to have a conversation so that he could know what language they spoke and what languages they didn't speak. Doesn't take a rocket science to realize that it didn't take them long to go right back to their old ways as soon as Nehemiah left. Well, that's the second bell. I still feel like I have another 30 seconds or so. So I will simply say this. Thank you very much for your attention. There's a whole lot that we can learn from Nehemiah, a whole lot. And Nehemiah is a man who gives us a lot of things that we can work to add to the repertoire of our own character. Okay? Steadfastness, reliance upon God. Reliance upon God, reliance upon God. Every time Nehemiah ran into a situation, the first thing he did when facing that situation was pray. He took it to the Lord, and then he acted. Then he did something along those lines. Every single time. He prayed, and then he acted. He prayed, and then he put guards up on the wall. He prayed, and then he had the people to work with their sword in one hand and a building block in the other hand. That's what he did. And he stayed focused on the mission. He stayed focused on the work. If we do that in our daily lives, not only will we prosper in our secular jobs, but we will bring a beacon of light amongst our coworkers and amongst our neighbors that they won't recognize as being natural, and they'll want to know where it's coming from. And there's your opportunity to share Christ with them. So again, thank you very much. We'll see you next week at 7 p.m.
So with one voice we'll sing There is great reward. before all of creation, all that I see